It's so nice to see needed rain without a watch or a warning attached to it. So that was good. So my name is Chris Campion. I'm Executive Director of the Windham Regional Commission. The Windham Regional Commission, we serve 27 towns in southeast Vermont, 23 towns in Windham County, Reedsboro, Searsburg, and Winhall, and Bennington County, and Weston and Windsor County. And the way this came to be is we received funding through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to do housing navigation, which was left to us for us to define. And those of you who were here Tuesday night have already heard this. And we were trying, and what we were thinking about was, you know, it's really every town, you know, seems to recognize the acute housing need that we have, and that this is a problem that's been coming for a long time, and the solutions are not going to be immediate. But you know, we make it really challenging through the Vermont governance model, where each town has been trying to figure out the housing situation in isolation from one another. So this is an experiment. What we wanted to see was, hey, what if we pulled together people from 4 towns that have been talking about housing and village revitalization and dealing with, like, okay, so how can we grow in places where they're not, where property and lives aren't put at risk of flood, aging populations, just everything the planning commissions and select boards and just the population has been talking about. So this is a bold experiment to basically see if having a conversation about opportunities in each town, but also thinking about, oh, there are these opportunities in these neighboring towns I didn't think about, just to see if this is a worthwhile conversation. So once the information is presented tonight, we want to just get your feel, like, was this worthwhile? Was it interesting? Is this something you think other towns in our region might benefit from? Why we chose these 4 towns, so it's Weston, Winhall, Jamaica, and Londonderry. Each of these towns has been having these detailed conversations around you know, housing, infrastructure, right? Londonderry's got a grant to put in 2 systems. They passed a bond. They've been doing housing planning. They developed a plan for the North Village. They're working on a plan for the South Village. Jamaica is doing a wastewater engineering study. Winhall had expressed interest in looking at, like, village center designation for Bonneville, and maybe what does that mean for wastewater. And then Weston probably has more physical constraints than most of the other villages, but they've created, like, basically, I'm going to butcher the term, but basically like a resilience committee, trying to figure out, like, how can we make the village more resistant and resilient to flooding, given the dynamics that happen there and given how many properties were damaged during the last flood. Of course, all of y'all are talking about that too. So we decided to start with this corner. So we'll see what happens. And what we did was we reached out to the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning program at UMass Amherst and said, hey, would you be interested in supporting this? And they said, hey, yeah, we would. And by the way, we've got connections with the American Institute of Architecture Community by Design program. Let's talk. And so we created this partnership, and it's been great. And so I'm going to turn over to them in just a second. But Tuesday night, we had a discussion with people, with those who came from the 4 towns, to basically talk about their vision for housing, their needs, their desires, what they dream about, what their concerns are. And the team that's been working, of professionals and students, what they've been doing is taking that and then been traveling around the 4 towns, looking at different sites, and just coming up with ideas about, hey, have you thought about this? Now, what's coming out of this is not a specific plan or a law or a rule or regulation or anything. It's just ideas. So that the idea being that take this information, there's going to be a report that's going to be produced beyond what you see tonight, and it's grist for the mill for people to talk about in the various committees, your planning commissions, your select boards. Just think about what you heard. Are there germs of ideas there that you might want to pursue? So very low-key conversation. What you do with it is up to you. But the important thing is we're having a conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne. He's going to introduce his team and tell you about what they did and what you're going to see tonight. I have not seen this, so I'm as excited as you.
Yeah, Chris is very supportive for someone who doesn't know what we're going to say. So as Chris said, this is not a plan. This is really to give you lots of ideas, of opportunities. So both sort of ideas, some that could work on a town-by-town basis, ideas that some could be work regionally, And to be honest, the 4 towns, maybe that's not the necessary region. I mean, regionalization has some great benefits, but we've only looked at the 4 towns, so you may choose other boundaries. But I think the point we want to drive home is there are opportunities across here. So my name is Wayne Fiden. I'm Director of the Center for Resilient Metro Regions at UMass. There's going to be 5 of us talking tonight, so they're going to each introduce themselves. But we have, I can't even add up, 8 people working behind the scenes. So I just wanted 2 seconds to introduce them. You guys want to come up and just, or you can stand there and just say who you are?
I'm Peter Flinker. I'm a landscape architect from Northampton, Massachusetts.
I'm Judy Barrett. I'm a consultant from south of Boston.
I'm Amelia LaValle. I'm a graduate student at UMass Amherst. I'm Nicole Krantz, an undergraduate student at UMass Amherst.
I'm Grace. I'm also an undergrad at UMass.
I'm Sarah. I'm a graduate student at UMass.
I'm Vietnam. I am the physical student at UMass.
I'm Emma from Thailand, Bangkok. I'm a fellow student at the UMass as well.
I'm Cheryl Morgan. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm an architect and planner and have years of teaching with Auburn University.
And I'm Elizabeth Infield from UMass Amherst.
And Wayne, actually, just quickly, this is Sue West, our Associate Director, who's been our staff leader on this. And Nan Fidel, who is our new Assistant Planner, who came to us out of UMass Amherst starting this summer.
And I noticed I'm here, but do you want to introduce Matt in absentia?
Oh yeah, and Matt Bockler is another senior planner. He's working with, I think, every one of your towns on projects and planning and zoning and everything else.
Hi everyone, Erin Simmons. I'm with the Architects Foundation in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Joel Mills, also with the Architects Foundation.
So, we did say, we're just giving you ideas and opportunities and talk about regionalization, but it's not just that. I think one of the things we really want to stress to you all is, and we've done a lot of these things, and the big difference between success and failure is basically, do you have champions? Do you do these things locally? So we're going to, as you listen to this, the very last exercise we're going to do is ask you, what do you do tomorrow? What do you do in the next 6 months? So keep that in the back of your mind, because basically, you're wasting your time and we're wasting our time if it just sits on a shelf. So we want to think about what are the opportunities. So we try to present it that way. So we're going to go through this, rapid fire today. I don't know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, going to deliver a written report that has a lot more detail than we cannot possibly deliver in the short time period. We started, and maybe 2/3 of you were here before. 2 nights ago when we did this, we started with these small stakeholder meetings in each of the 4 towns, mostly town officials. And then we came here and we listened to you. Again, the report's going to write down all the comments. But I think most important is what became the title for this project, right? You want homes for you, for people who live here, people who work here, people who were born here, maybe moved away but can't come back. No news there, but we think that's really important to focus on that. And this is not to be negative for people who want to have second homes here, and they love coming up here, but we need to be inclusive. We need to make sure that we house the people who are here and, anybody else that's out there. So I won't go through this so you can read the slide just as well as I am, but a lot of what we've heard people talk about is the missing middle, housing for people earning median income. I think we want to make a point on, there seems to be some discussion about affordable housing as we're looking for. We want this missing middle. I just want to point out that an awful lot of people who live here and work here are people who are eligible for affordable housing. The people who work the ski slopes, the people who work the restaurants, maybe except for the chef and the owner. The people who work the hotels, the people who work probably every service industry out here. They're all at that income level for doing it. So we want to think about, it's not a one or the other, it's a one size fits all. We've joked a little bit that our approach is a bit of a shotgun approach. There's lots of great opportunities. The hardest of all, obviously, is money, and we're not here to write you a check for $40 million. But there's an incredible amount of things you can do without that, and some things certainly can free up money for the process. So, we tried to listen to all that. So a lot of conversation about housing, how important the housing was, a little bit of a sort of debate, if you will, of people saying, it's great to live in the village. It's great to have walkability, but we need affordability too, and sometimes that means the villages aren't enough. So when we can do housing in the village, great, but sometimes we need other things. And so we get to site opportunities. You're going to hear some of that reflecting on what are the opportunities in villages, at the edge of villages, and then new small villages in other places. And at the same time, this maybe is where you heard the most diverse things, but you all have their aspirations that are environmental aspirations and social service aspirations and the quality of life that you want here. And we're focused more on the housing, but we're certainly well aware of that and think about this is a system, and the system needs to support itself. So as we go through this process, we're going to reflect on what does that mean to be a system going forward in the process. And obviously, you've all experienced flooding in a magnitude, in recent years, so obviously everything has to be in the context of that and the difficulty for moving around in the process. One of the things we often talk about is, you have a challenge with affordability if more than 30% of your income is going to housing, but the other figure is you have a challenge if more than 15% of your income is going to transportation. So it's collectively that's 45%, so the transportation piece shows up on this piece as well. And I'm not going to spend time on this, but the state's been doing a good job in some ways. So the state has these two great publications. I make my students read them because they're good. One's sort of, a big design manual on what does this mean. You're going to see some of the ideas reflected in specific sites. It's great. It's online if you don't have this already. And then that just came out this year, and then a few years ago, a manual for zoning. It's pretty straightforward and not cutting edge. But I think you're going to hear some members of the group reflect later. Some of these pretty straightforward, not cutting edge things are not reflecting your zoning. So there are opportunities to mine some of the ideas that we're going to present in these reports going forward in the process. And then, this is, I guess, the depressing thing for me. We came out here, when were we here for the preliminary? March. So, between January of June of this year, statewide, I don't know what it is for this area, but statewide housing prices in Vermont have gone up 5%. I suspect that's at least true here, if not more. And then the other state figure is not only has gone up 5%, but the time that properties sit on the market has not gone up at all, which means there are buyers who are ready to grab those places. A lot of them are cash buyers, don't need mortgages. So the problem is not getting better. And again, I know it's a statewide figure, but I think you're probably even worse for some of those things. And then, there are some things, I know you're going through this, I know Bonneville is looking at getting a village center designation. We were really excited about this new Act 250 amendment that passed that makes it easier to get, infill and village development. And so there's some big opportunities. It creates a lot of work for you to be eligible for that new status, but we want to talk about that. And then, the sewage regulation. I spent 8 years of my life in Vermont knowing every part of the sewage regulations. That was my life. That was a long time ago, but I've been following it ever since. Vermont's mostly kept up with the technology. There are some places where the technology is behind. We're going to talk about this more in the report, but just my example here is you're always worried that if you build a house, you might expand the house, right? That makes sense. But there seems to be a fear in the state that if you build a one-bedroom house, you're more likely to expand than if you build a two-bedroom house. So one of the solutions that some places have for affordability if you don't have children is encouraging smaller units. One-bedroom houses, tiny houses, whatever you want. But the state says the smallest you can design a system for is a two-bedroom house. So that means if you're building a tiny house or a one-bedroom house, you're paying the freight. So there's things like that Vermont hasn't necessarily kept up with the time for doing. So we're going to spend a little more time on that. And then the Act 250, I suspect some of you I'm sure know this far better than we do. Some of you may not know this. I'm not going to put the whole list, but you're exempt. You fall out of Act 250 if you fit this list, right? If your village center goes through the designation process. Bonneville not there yet. Most of your other village centers are. Quarter mile from that is exempt. But you have to do these other things. You need to show that you have adequate water or you have adequate wastewater. Some of the villages probably already qualify in terms of adequate wastewater. Certainly when you implement, and I know there's going to be different time periods for different towns, when you implement, village-wide wastewater disposal systems, you're going to be qualified for that. There's limits I think you're probably all following these days, having seen what happens in the flood, but you can't. This isn't for development of the floodplain, this isn't for development in high erosion areas. You have to have a town plan, you have to have zoning, which Jamaica doesn't have, subdivision regs on the books. So those that, when we think about sort of what are the low-hanging fruit, there are things that, I don't want to speak for Jamaica, but they could have zoning to help them move forward. There are plans that you're in different stages. Some towns are going through the planning process, some are pretty far along. But thinking about that, those are things that you control. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's needed that you have no control over whatsoever. But at least I think we want to leave you with is do the things that you can control and move them forward. And so, we're going to talk in the report about what are the partnerships you can do? Because you can't do this alone. And I think that's why Chris talks about the regionalization, there's partnerships. So we're just looking at, what are there partnerships that might fit? So we know there's a meeting going on in Jamaica right now. It's probably why there's no one here from Jamaica, about are they going to close the village school? This sort of thing you can imagine is, well, if they close the school district, right, there's a regional school district, could they say, hey, Jamaica, we're sorry we're closing your school, we're at least going to give you the property for free instead of being an asset we sell so that you can get housing. Right. That may not work, but we want to think about those kinds of opportunities. Some communities with high-end housing, ski areas in particular, have given preferences for teachers or for other municipal employees, but particularly for teachers, to attract them to an area where they couldn't otherwise live, where their salary is. So some communities give preference for that. Some of your school districts are regional again. Some of your towns have more capacity for housing than other towns. So you can imagine partnerships, right? Maybe one town can provide land, another town can provide money. So just sort of think about all those kinds of opportunities that are out there. And then, this is sort of like a partnership, but you're on different stages during the town of thinking about wastewater capacity for the village. Whether it's, private wastewater system at Magic Mountain, whether it's, the capacity eventually to hook onto Stratton system for Winhall, Windham, but that, of course, is a big lumpy project. You can't do that for a small project because the cost of getting there is so much, and then the village is looking at expanding in different stages. So you can imagine saying, this is great, and we want to do this. It's going to serve the existing homes, the existing businesses, and that's the primary goal. But there's some room for expansion at different levels, and you can imagine putting that, dedicating that room for expansion for community housing, economic development, and some of those uses might open up more grant opportunities, right? ARPA funds will be gone, but there are other grants that encourage those things. So that's what it means sort of by these opportunities. So I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Infield.
Great, thanks, Wayne. All right, that was a lot already, right? I'm just going to talk about a few background conditions that we can keep in mind as we go forward, looking at the alternatives that the team has come up with. So I think a lot about climate change. I think a lot about planning for climate change. I'm just going to give you, if I can figure out how to use my... I guess I should have asked Wayne how you do this. Maybe I could just do this. Okay. So we'd like to think about climate change as something in the future, but in fact our climate has already changed. Change is underway. These numbers are actually for the difference between now and 50 years ago. So we're already about 3 degrees hotter in Vermont. We're already having spring come 2 weeks early and winter come 1 week later. And this one sort of is the big one around here. There's already 7 more inches a year of precipitation, which is a lot. What we know is that it's going to be more of that, right? There's going to be more storms. It's going to be hotter. I would suggest by 2050, like another, 8 degrees total increase is a reasonable number. And that's an average over the year, right? And also occasional droughts. That doesn't feel like something you have to worry about right now, given the way the last few years have been, but it is sort of factually likely. So keep that in mind, but I never talk about climate change unless I can also talk about the things that we can do to address climate change. And I would point out 3 things in particular that seem especially relevant here. And I know Chris has talked about this a lot with me. Generally, the rivers need more room to flood, right? We know that. So there's that. When you think about new construction, people will probably start needing air conditioning. I just got air conditioning in my house in Massachusetts, and I moved there. People were like, oh, I don't need air conditioning here. Well, now we do. So energy efficient heating and air conditioning for new construction. And then as you go forward and you think about your village centers and your parking lots, thinking about how they can absorb stormwater more effectively. landscape architects have a lot of ways to do this, and there's a lot of guides and things for things you can do on your own property as well. So those would be 3 things that are like sort of easy wins. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I know there was a lot of, the Vermont Digger did a lot of reports about climate migration into Vermont, and I got really interested in this. In Western Mass, you know, we're right on the highway corridor from New York City. So we're thinking about it too. So I worked with a colleague of mine on a study on this to see what happened during COVID, to see whether it would give us any hints about what's likely in terms of climate migration. And in fact, what we see, the colors here got really washed out. But from the Boston metro area and north, there was a lot of movement into those areas inland during COVID. And you know that experientially, but it might be nice just to see it sort of laid out factually. And I think it's a reasonable guess that that's how climate migration trends will go. I will say it's super hard to project because most people stay within the region. Like most people from Boston are not moving up here. They're just moving from Boston coast a little bit inland. So it's not like all of Boston is going to move to Vermont. It's not that bad. So those are some background trends. And then I just wanted to talk about population really quickly. So a key factor here, particularly in Winhall, is that all of the green parts is the second home and Airbnb, houses that are not available for year-round residents. And the light blue is the houses that are available, housing that's available for year-round residents. And so you sort of, I'm sure you know this experientially, but I thought you might like to sort of see it laid out, that it's an ongoing challenge. And then the other thing that the statistics support is that the population is getting older in most places. Winhall has bucked that trend. The average age there has actually gone, the percentage of people over 65 has gone down. But in the other towns, it's increasing. And so thinking about housing for people over 65 and over is going to be an important part of the solution set. So then we did these projections. We had the trends, and Sarah, who helped me out enormously in this, we did the study to try and do projections for the town. I'm not going to bore you with too many numbers, but fundamentally, if we assume a 1% growth rate based on existing trends up to 2020, this is roughly what you need. It's about 852 housing units across the 4 towns, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. I respect that. But what we wanted to see is whether that was even feasible, right? Because it sounds like a lot. So, oops, sorry, back one. So we looked at how much land it would take if you assume a 1/4 acre per unit, and then, you know, like a mix of single family and sort of small lot, some multifamily, like that. So it's not very dense. It takes about 34 acres in Jamaica. It's not really that bad when you think about it that way. I think it feels a little more doable than just looking at the numbers. And so overall, I think it's hopefully less. When you look at that, you go like, oh, okay, I think we can picture that. We can come up with that. 5 acres at a time, you know? Yeah.
Have you ever looked at apartment dwellings versus just townhomes or cottages, or they're all single-family homes, or is that a zoning?
You know, if you did a lot of apartments, then you wouldn't need this many acreage.
Right.
We just had to pick a number, frankly.
Right. I don't know if that isn't allowed within the 250 zoning.
Oh,
Question.
this is a point my colleague Judy is going to go into with some detail. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question.
And Elizabeth, I failed to mention that also on Thursday, Elizabeth and Sarah developed a very detailed report, which is available. It's on our website. So she just gives you some highlights here. There's a very detailed report you can access.
So, really quickly, the main points I hope you'll take home is that you have low vacancy, you know that. You have high demand, you know that. If you don't build up the supply, housing prices are going to keep going up. Like and that there's a clear need for year-round housing. And so we have to be careful when we think about that. that it won't take that much land to provide, and that there are opportunities from my perspective in this over 65. One of the things that happens if you move into, if you downsize, that means there's a house that you're leaving that somebody else can buy. And that affordable rental is going to be a really important part of this solution set. And with that, I will turn it over to Judy, who's going to give you the down low on the zoning.
So I have this terrible feeling I'm the one that everybody's going to hate here. Because one of the things that I learned, my firm does a lot of zoning work. And when you're doing planning work, people have ideals, they express them, they have these aspirations for their community. But then when you actually start to try to write the zoning that would implement those things, people begin to say, well, that's my backyard. So although much of what we're talking about in this presentation, why isn't this moving forward?
Yeah, that's why I had to use those.
Sorry, folks. Although we're talking about 4 communities working together and there are things you should do together and can do together, ultimately zoning is something that each town has to decide on its own. So there is this need, I think, to be thinking about where is your community in the sort of spread or the realm of addressing the housing needs that are here? What can each community do? So when we start a zoning project, we always look at, well, what did your most recent plan say? What did you say in your plans about what you want to be and what you want to do? And then we get into what I call a zoning diagnostic or a zoning audit. And I confess to you, we have not completed zoning audits on all 4 towns. But we did look at particular things that matter for this project. So we look at use and dimensional regulations. That's a basic. We looked for how much land is zoned for some of the uses that perhaps are needed here. Sometimes we find when we're working at studies in communities where there's a real need for multifamily housing, when you look at the zoning map, you realize how small the area is where it actually wouldn't even be allowed at all. We look at off-street parking. It tends to be unfortunately, sometimes a weapon in this field to sort of stop certain types of development. We look at the permitting procedures. How hard is it for somebody to get an approval? What does it take to get a yes? Or how easy is it to get a no? And then we looked also just at the short-term rental situation because I know it's an issue here. And just for, it's going to drive me nuts. Huh?
I can tell you what.
Yeah, do you mind?
No, I don't mind.
Thanks. Because I like to walk around. If I have to stand over there, I'm going to die. So we looked at the community plans, and this is not a detailed summary. It's just telling you what I saw as I looked through them. And although I know you have the regional plan, you have the plan that Elizabeth's group worked on, I wanted to see what your towns actually said about yourselves. So I looked at the plans that we had available. And so in Londonderry, there were several plans, including the Camoin plan from a couple of years ago, which I was particularly interested in reading because I've done some work with them before. And so there are ideas in the plan that I thought, oh, well, this is good. We want housing-friendly zoning. We want to address short-term rentals. We want to think about ADUs. We should have a housing commission. We should think about home sharing and lease to locals. And just to be clear, I do a lot of work on the Cape and Islands region in Massachusetts, so lease to locals and ADUs are just like part of my life. Anyway, this is what your plan said. That was one plan. Now let's look at the next one. We looked at what we had for Weston, which was 2016, and then a red line update, I think, to 2024. And one of the things I noticed in it is that there haven't been any multifamily permits for like the last 5 years. I thought, so the plan talks about encouraging housing for families, for young workers, for retirees, for lower income people. Encouraging ADUs. Encouraging multifamily village infill. And working with nonprofits. So that was the messaging I got from Weston. Next one. In Winhall, it was the ideas for change or for going forward were to encourage ADUs, to require adequate facilities for new housing, addressing senior housing and family housing needs. I was kind of happy to see attention to family housing. They don't always see that. People hate kids now, it's just absolutely horrible. And then supporting efforts of nonprofits, developers to create affordable housing. I thought, well, that's all plausible, given what the plan says about the needs. And then Jamaica, what I saw in that plan was recognizing second home ownership has increased and exerts pressure on the local market. I don't think that's any big surprise. Providing affordable housing depends on and should be encouraged by organizations like your nonprofits. And that is important because they have access to funding that sometimes for-profit developers don't. Protecting the affordability of public and private affordable units. Protecting affordable housing really matters to people in my business because once you create it, you want to keep it. Directing new housing growth to areas with access to goods and services makes absolute sense, and then encouraging ADUs. So this was the picture I had coming out of the plans. Then I went into your zoning, and I found a somewhat different story. Multifamily dwellings are absolutely critical for affordable housing. I can't emphasize this enough. They are critical from a developer's point of view for financial feasibility. They create choice, so they matter. And they are an efficient use of land. They require scale. The existing dimensional regulations in all of your towns are not suitable for multifamily development, not at the scale that's needed. And I recognize that wastewater is a critical issue, so I'm not here to talk about that. I want you to just listen to me as though your wastewater issue is somehow addressed. Because one thing I've learned in this business over 35 years is that sometimes communities rely a little too much on wastewater to manage what actually is a land use decision. So in addition, what I saw, and this again is just a review of all 4 towns, so not allowed by right in any of these towns. And then off-street parking requirements sometimes are equal to or greater than what's required for a single-family dwelling. These kinds of things can make multifamily housing impossible to do. Next one. Shelter, transitional housing, things of this nature are very important to have as part of a community. One of the most moving stories I ever heard in my time in this business was from a 4th grade class in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, where I asked kids, if you moved away and you came back in a year, what would you want to see here? And they talked about different things, their playground, their school, and then out of this little boy's mouth came something I have never forgotten. He said, I hope the homeless shelter is still here, because that was our first home. You have homelessness here, it's everywhere. And yet, when I look at your zoning, nobody talks about shelter or transitional housing or any kind of supportive housing. Those things are critical to address long-term homelessness. It's not found in any of your regulations by right or by conditional use permit. It's just not there. And when you know homelessness exists and it's part of the housing picture, it's something for you to be thinking about when you think about zoning reform. Next slide. What's a family? This is one of my favorites. So, defining family by requiring households to be related by blood, marriage, adoption, some operation of law, but then capping the number of unrelated people who can live together, that's a potential problem under the Federal Fair Housing Act, because you're treating 2 types of households unequally. And it's something you need to think about, because that can interfere with congregate housing, that can interfere with employer-assisted housing, because people by definition are living in a structure and they're not related. It can interfere with any kind of housing that involves unrelated individuals. And some of your zoning bylaws do have this kind of definition, so it's something for you to think about. Next slide. The approval process. So, zoning really should say what communities want. I'm a firm believer in this. If you want something, like the wants that you have in your plans, I would hope your zoning would say just that. Unfortunately, it doesn't always do that. Conditional use approval is discretionary by definition, by law. So if I see conditional use in a table of uses, I think, well, maybe we want it, maybe we don't. What do the abutters say? It's not encouraging to developers. So if you want something, you need to actually carry it all the way through your zoning from saying, I want it, I allow it at a scale and a density that makes sense, and I'm going to approve it if it meets certain guidelines, which of course you can have in your zoning. ADUs could be an easy thing to deal with here, but it's a conditional use permit and all the zoning that I looked at. So that's an example of something that could be kind of an easy fix, especially to deal with smaller housing unit creation. Multifamily housing is expensive to build. It has code requirements that attach to it that don't attach to single-family dwellings. Discretionary approval adds risk. Next slide. Short-term rentals. Statutory definition. Working in Vermont is fascinating, by the way, because it's a totally different picture from what I see in New Hampshire and a totally different picture from Massachusetts. So your statutory definition is it's a unit that's rented for less than 30 consecutive days and at least 14 per year. So underneath that 14 is something else. It's not regulated consistently throughout the state or certainly locally. There's a discussion that needs to happen about how much of the housing situation we have right now is a chicken and egg problem. In other words, how much of the shortage of housing is because of the short-term rental and seasonal housing market versus you don't have enough supply. Burlington has attempted to, you probably all know this, Burlington adopted a short-term rental ordinance that is now in court. The question is, did they go too far? Everybody's trying to deal with this problem, or this need. I mean, there's two sides to the stories I think you all know. One is, it's killing our housing market. The other is, it's helping people stay in their homes. So there's a whole bigger conversation that needs to happen. Nonetheless, regulation makes sense. Londonderry, as I understand it, has adopted a short-term rental bylaw and also funded an administrator to oversee the registration and enforcement process. That to me is a big deal, because that's a town that I see as saying, we got a problem, we want to address it, and we're going to do it, and we're going to put our money there. I see that as a potential opportunity for some of you other towns to maybe think about, is there a way to address short-term rental management on a regional basis instead of trying to do it town by town? Bottom line, there are too many markets competing for the same inadequate supply. It's not just short-term rentals, and it's not just seasonal housing. When I work in New Hampshire, people hate me. They say, oh, you're from Boston. You people came up here and you ruined our housing market. No, that's really not what happened. It's just a piece of a bigger story. Housing quality problems affect both homeowners and renters. I think some of your plans really recognize that. That's another issue that needs to be addressed here. It's not necessarily a zoning issue, but it's something you need to be thinking about. Next slide. So I just took a little look. I don't have all 4 towns up here, because I didn't want to go on all night. But I took a look at, well, what's the income distribution in your community? And I looked at Londonderry because it was the data set I had immediately available. This is from 2 years ago. And I just looked at people who are low income, moderate income, or middle income, whatever that means. How many of them are cost burdened? And what that means is they're paying more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. And you can get these tables at a general level, or you can get them from the federal government at a detailed level by town, by income group. And that's what matters to me as a housing person. So I just looked at this. Not surprising, in the lowest income groups, you have 70-odd% of the households who are living unaffordably where they are now. And the percentages vary, 43%, 65%. What that chart's telling you is that when you get up to the sort of median income number, do you all know what median income is? Anybody who doesn't know that? If you picture your town and you line up all the household incomes in it, the midpoint. So what's the midpoint? So income limits for affordable housing are based on percentages of that median. 30% we call extremely low, 50% we call very low, and 80% we call low. So as you go up the sort of income spectrum, you expect to see a drop in the number of people who are cost burdened. That doesn't always happen here, and a lot of it is because most of your cost burdened households are homeowners. So it's a different mix of people. Next slide, please. About 80%, if I just did the statistics for all 4 towns as a group, about 80% of your cost burden households are at or below what we call 80% of median income. That is the standard that's set federally. The state uses the same standard. It's essentially people who are enough below the median to have housing costs, transportation costs, food costs that become a problem for them. And of course, the farther you are from that median, the more problematic your existence is. Your extremely low income renters are also very cost burdened, but most of these people are homeowners. All of this has implications, in my view, as a housing person, of what your communities can do and what may be the most effective way to support affordable housing care and housing choice. And you guys get to do the fun stuff.
Figure out the remote. Battery out?
Yeah, just press that.
All right. I'm Peter. This is Cheryl. I'm a landscape architect. She's an architect. We're both planners. So that means we could go on for hours about designing and planning housing, because that's our lives and we love it. But one of the things we want to focus on tonight is how do we build housing that doesn't come at the expense of the character of our villages, which is everything from the historic character of beautiful old houses that haven't changed for hundreds of years, to the character of knowing all your neighbors and not really wanting to have strangers move into the area. And then how do we build housing that's not at the expense of our precious rural landscapes, which is fundamental to what's great about Vermont and also your economy. So the challenge is, how do we find sites and approaches to designing on those sites that really protect historic resources and visual character, that help maintain a high quality of life. And we've been talking a lot about, what comes along housing that can make life better, like, better pedestrian connections. How do you repair the social fabric and build a sense of community? So where you put the housing is important, because people living together form a community, hopefully. And then how can the housing enhance economic opportunities? We've heard a lot about the challenges where employees can't live in the same communities where they work, and this is universal across New England. And the answer is to build more housing where people work, or close to it. This started with Elizabeth and Sarah's work, really looking at the whole region and trying to do a detailed computer-based GIS analysis of what's all the land that can't be built because it's either protected or it's undevelopable, too steep, and so on. And then of the part that is buildable, what's better in terms of access to existing village centers, access to roads and transportation, and so on. And they came up, there's a whole report that describes that process. But basically we started with that, thinking about how can we develop, particularly with close approximation, close distance to existing centers. And so there was sort of that abstract, well not abstract, but table desktop analysis. And then over the last few days, we've been talking a lot to local partners in each of the towns about where the opportunities are and where the needs are locally for housing. So where do you have potentially town-owned sites, which is a really critical opportunity we'll talk about if you're trying to create affordability, because otherwise you're competing with the whole market for the cost of land. Where do you have willing property owners that either need to do the right thing because they're not getting any attention from developers, or they want to do the right thing and sort of build more housing in their communities? And where do you have unused, underutilized, or vacant land? We've seen a lot of properties that probably are really expensive to buy, but have, they're vacant buildings and they need some TLC. So through this process, just this week, we've identified, 15 or 16 sites in each of the 4 towns. And for the purpose of exploring these questions, we're sort of looking at each site, trying to determine what could you build there, does this seem like a good place? And we've been working hard over the last couple of days, but we haven't done all 15 sites to the same level of detail. But we hope that we can demonstrate sort of typical approaches in different conditions. So what we discovered, looking at all the different possibilities, is there's basically 3 types of potential housing sites. There's sort of the gaps within an existing village, and sort of an opportunity to fill in those gaps where there's little open space or buildings that could be replaced. There's the idea of where could you expand around the edges of the villages. And again, the design is really important because a lot of your villages, part of the sense of that is, oh, it's surrounded by beautiful forest or farms. And you don't want to stick an ugly subdivision right on the edge of the village because that really ruins the sense both of the countryside and the village again. So the question is, how can you sort of expand in a way that's sensitive to both of those things? And then what about creating new villages? We've identified some opportunities for places that aren't developed at all now, but particularly might be in some former use where they've been disturbed, gravel pits, DPW headquarters, that kind of things, or vacant land that's really in a good spot that could be developed as an entirely new center of activity or a new village. And really the place to start is realizing that there's a lot of multifamily housing in all of your existing villages and always has been. And so Grace and some of our other students have been busy going out and inventorying and taking pictures of these different places and really seeing there's different ways traditionally that people have accommodated more than one home in one structure. And there's a lot of existing structures that have the potential to add multifamily housing on upper stories, on the back of a building, in a wing or an L. There's buildings on the main streets which could have shops on the ground floor and apartments above them. Some already do. Maybe some lost the apartments, but those could be brought back. And then there's a fair number, as I said, of vacant or abandoned properties. Some of them abandoned for good reason. Couldn't build a septic. They're in a wetland. Others, like the Magic Mountain Hotel, it's a long story there. We'll talk about a little bit more. So basically what we're going to do quickly in the next few minutes is sort of go through our initial take on sites in all 4 towns. And part of this is to get your feedback on, particularly if you see a site you think this is crazy, please tell us. And if you think, oh, this is a great opportunity, then number one, you should do more work on this. We want to hear that too.
And I think the other thing is that you'll see that some are more just pointing out these sites and they're intriguing to us and what might happen there. We have some ideas. Some of them we've drilled down deeper because we think those are the sites that either where we need you to begin to think creatively about how you use them, or we think maybe are the most challenging for you to believe us if we say this is how you can move forward with this site. So you're going to see some are just, what would happen? Others, we've actually done some illustrative work to explore those issues, particularly of character and how you could imagine it would be a good addition to your community.
So this is an overview of the village of Jamaica, and we're really focusing on 2 potential sites, one on the main street and one on the former school site, and we'll talk about both of those. So this is the 3 Mountain Inn site. This is existing conditions, and then this is the proposal.
So this is, I'm sure you can visualize it. It's right on the street. We understand that there's a property owner here who's thinking about, could I add more apartments? And our conclusion is yes, but one of the ways to do that is to take the prototype, the image and character of the buildings you have, which are very simple. They're sort of dumb boxes, the simplest kind of thing to build. And if you begin to place those around the outer perimeter, you've created some continuity, and it can look like not only does it belong, but perhaps that it's always been there.
Right, what's particularly nice is this repeats the kind of the sculptural quality you get from traditional houses, right? You can't see the whole thing at once, and it's really interesting as you go walk past it or you walk into it. And that's something that's not that hard to do if you're careful, but a lot of people don't. This is the school site. The existing school is here with the parking lot, driveways on a loop road, and there's a nice, looks like a pretty new playground in the back. And then
those
there's
are-
a break right here where it slopes quickly down to an area that's categorized as wetland and floodplain by the state.
But the school itself, those of you who know, it sits up on a plateau that makes it extremely interesting to us because it's relatively flat, again, easier building conditions, it's already cleared of trees. We don't think the buildings that are there are particularly retrievable, so the site itself, which is potentially, as you heard Wayne talk about, could be community owned, and that having the property, not having to carry the cost of the land, is an incentive to attract building partners.
So this is one way that could be developed for a mix of different housing types, and Cheryl will talk more about that. But basically keeping the existing entrance on both sides, creating a new sort of a loop road around what's now the current school location, and then keeping the playground in the back, creating a new green, and then sort of lining different building types up around the edges. And we'll zoom in a little bit more, and Cheryl can talk about.
So one of the things that's interesting to us is to have a mix of housing types. So next to the playground at the top is senior housing. It's a bigger footprint building with apartments for the seniors. But in addition, closer to the road, we can imagine a set of townhouses and condominiums that would be attractive to young families and could be affordable and begin to mix that intergenerational mix. And we think those could be sold to help finance the project. And if there's appetite for that, the next layer back along that little parking cross area could be an additional for sale set of units. If there's less appetite, then those could become rental units. Then flanking this, we have at the lower right corner a kind of aggregate of townhouses that would look like your big house, little house, back house, barn that are collected together. And again, they're basically boxes that we just organized to have more visual character, similar on each side of the loop. And then at the top, we think this is the kind of complex that might house a daycare center or pre-K of some sort, as well as some community services. So a really simple box shed that could be for community meetings, for clubs, for nonprofits to use in those cases. So you don't have to do it this way. It's just our testing the capacity of the site. And for this site, there's almost 100 units. And we believe adequate parking, and it's in a, as we talked about several times the other day, in a safe place in terms of climate. This would be possible if the wastewater distribution systems that are being explored in Jamaica were online and had the potential for the capacity of this number of units. So we understand those are questions, but we think this is potentially a real way to add a lot of housing with a lot of variety on property that's public.
All right, we did look at a lot of other village centers. We haven't done as much detailed study. This is Rawsonville, which is interesting. It's also part of Jamaica, as you know. It's kind of a typical sort of rural crossroads with the two state highways coming together. It's got a commercial strip which has a fair amount of potential for filling in some of the gaps. That's again a whole nother lecture about how you retrofit commercial strips. But housing can be part of that. In the back of lots, sort of taking advantage of the parking that serves the commercial during the day, or above the shops. But we also want to talk a little bit about, I guess we're not,
Well,
this property.
so this is Bear Creek, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a multi-unit housing footprint that's practically invisible in your town. It's dated if you go up there. I remember when we did architecture like that. But it's a great example of how multifamily housing can have low impact on your character of community. The land down the hill, which is next to the little service station cafe, is in a covenant, we think, that's related to the Bear Creek development with some conservation. We don't quite understand how those covenants apply over time. Are there land swaps possible? Are there other things that could happen? But when we look at that large flat area at this crossroads, at a node in your region, where better to put community connectors, to put some of your social services, some daycare, some things that can serve people in a lot of different directions. So maybe that site won't work, but this is a place in the region where we think those very robust services and those really critical needs would make tons of sense.
Up the road in Bondsville, there's a number of sites we also thought about. One of them is the existing sort of town hall complex, where there seems to be a fair amount of extra room. Maybe you could tuck some housing in behind that. There's also land which we believe is owned by Stratton, which is right adjacent to the existing services along the street. And again, it could be a place to tuck some housing, maybe similar to the other site that's sort of back in the woods and hidden, but within good walking distance of the center. And then the other is sort of interesting crossroads a little bit further up on the,
It's where the library is.
Right, where the library
is. And there's
is.
a fair amount of land behind the library. It is in the floodplain, but you're going to see some of the recommendations we have for some other places. There are methods for building when you look at how you elevate property. And again, if the structure itself is simple, and then those lower levels can accommodate parking, they can accommodate we would hope for permeable surfaces for some of the kinds of things that you heard about earlier. So we didn't illustrate these, but we're hoping you can extrapolate some of the other kind of illustrations we did to not imagine how you'd solve it, but to begin to think about, are they part of the conversation?
Also, I should say, if you're really excited about any of these, we are going to be doing more work for the final report, and we can take a little bit more detailed look at some of these properties, including possibly the Kendall Farm, which is this is zoomed way out, but this is Kendall Farm Road coming in, and it's a property of over 400 acres. This is zooming in a little bit, and it's mostly wooded.
And it's owned by the community of Winhall.
Right.
So part of the reasons it's interesting to us is over 400 acres. It's the end of the road there. There's a snowmobile path that comes right there. It is a dirt road, but this is a very large site, so the potential to begin to imagine an eco-village, to imagine that mix of sizes, types, and what we think is it can't just be a place that's housing, it needs to be a community. This would be one of those potential new villages. You'd want to add amenities that make it an attractive place to live for all these different price points, size points, age points. So whether that's some hot cocoa at the end of a snowmobile ride, or that begins to be some of the child care amenities, some Montessori school kinds of things. There's a lot of things that can be included. Peter's firm is up to your elbows in a project just like this, and it's just exciting to think about the possibilities. Again, the real capacity would be a function of how wastewater is managed and whether there can be connectivity to either existing capacity or whether the site itself can accommodate the wastewater because it's big. Development around a preserved meadow that perhaps becomes a wastewater field is the kind of thing that we think would be possible.
Right, and then the numbers is basically what's the carrying capacity for wastewater, water supply, road capacity getting out there. And so that sort of requires further study, but once you get that number, you can then lay out pretty much any number of different interesting village types in 400 acres, certainly. Now we're going to zoom up to South Londonderry. A couple of sites we're interested in. One is the sort of a crescent. This is Crescent Street, sort of a neighborhood there. There's the existing town offices. And then the third one, well, we'll start with Crescent Street. This is one we walked around, and one of the nice things that we looked for is where do you have multiple points of access in a village? Because if you just have the main street going down, it's hard to sort of create layers that make it walkable and also open up some of that land behind the village for redevelopment. And this has an existing, there's a big hill here with the Baptist church on top, but Crescent Street wraps around that. There seems to be some underutilized properties wrapping through there, and a lot of opportunities within this neighborhood to tuck some buildings similar to the example in Jamaica that would sort of repeat the same forms at a little bit higher density.
So these are private properties. This is a speculation about whether there would be interest. One of the buildings, the two buildings or properties across the street are vacant, and one is in a condition that's not, we think, unretrievable. The others have fine buildings or houses on them, but there's a lot of available land, or appears to be a lot of available land. So when we've talked earlier about some of the ways to create affordability is working at scale, any one of those might not be affordable, but if you're doing four collectively, if there's a partnership formed or an LLC, or maybe one of the housing trusts would work with you to help then have enough units to attract a small builder or developer. So this is an ideal we're planning more than a solution. This happened to be where we found 4 parcels within sight of each other with a laydown yard in the parking lot of the church. Right.
Another little site we thought was interesting is the Londonderry Inn property, which is on the south side of the bridge, but has a big piece of land, very steep, coming up the hill. But there's a series of terraces where you could tuck in townhouses built into the slope. Some of the frontage seems to be a very wide part of the road layout, publicly owned road layout, so there's some complications there, but also possibly some opportunities. So we think that's worth looking at. And then the last one is the municipal office property. This is the municipal office, the DPW garage, and then the library is down here. And again, we have lost the plan for that. We do have a plan for that.
Yes, we do have a plan for that, and it's...
it was wonderful.
Part of it is it's tucking up on the sort of terraces, the edges and the terrace where the town offices are by the old school, fencing off the garage yard, and I think we've got like 30 units and a mix of townhouses, apartments, and so townhouses, apartments, 6 over 6, and then a bigger apartment building that's tucked up. And no one would ever see any of this except the people who use it. A nice little village green common. So we'll find that.
Yeah, but basically sort of townhouses along the entry road. Weren't we just looking at that?
Yeah, we were.
On my machine?
I think so. We'll find it.
Sorry about that. And then this is the Prouty property, which is, as you know, it's being studied for wastewater management, but it's a big site. There's the salt shed here. This is with north going up to the left, big bend in the river. Fair amount of that is in floodplain, but up along the road and behind the knoll there seems to be a pretty good opportunity, assuming there's room left over from the wastewater plant, to build some larger multifamily houses.
The important part about this site for us to bring to you is it's publicly owned again, studying how you tuck needed housing in with that asset of public ownership. But it's also a node along this beautiful scenic corridor between the north and south town. Building nodes of development, not sprinkled housing along the edges, keeps the character of both your villages and your rural landscape. So that concept is what we want to leave you with here, as much as how do you solve it.
And then getting up into North Londonderry, we looked at a couple of interesting sites. One is there's a public, there's a cemetery here, and behind that there's a recreational complex, which also seems to have a fair amount of extra land that's not being used. There might be a possibility to tuck new development on the edge of the village.
I don't think
trees.
you guys know how much land you own.
Yeah. And then there's the old mill restaurant, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The ball fields, again, a big area of ball fields, but then also a large area of forest.
And the important thing for us is it seems there's a connected path by the cemetery, so development there could have a walkability without being on the road into the village center.
And then, so this is the old mill site, again, close to the river, as you know, floodplain wrapping around that, but a fair amount as the road rises up toward the bridge. There's a sloping site that if you tuck the building into the slope and perhaps put parking underneath new buildings, you could get quite a lot of development, but also avoid flooding the worst of it, as Cheryl will explain.
So the idea here is you build up on a plinth or above parking, which then can flood. You get your cars out of there. But it can flood, it can percolate back. So we were talking earlier about giving floodwater a place to go. This does. And then the other part of this idea is almost everything along the edge there is threatened and in floodplain. And short of tearing it all down, if you're going to maintain the village edge, then you've got to have a way of building up so that those buildings are not vulnerable in the way the lower buildings. So if you imagine the mill, we took away the mill. We love the beauty of that structure, but the idea of something not unlike it in scale and character, which could have restaurants and bars and breweries and all that stuff, it's above parking, and the platform beyond where you spill out with tables and chairs and a big fireplace. And then across, there's access to parking and two-story units that have the proportions and the character of your existing neighborhoods. They are above a parking level that has big holes in the walls so the floodwater can come in and rise up like it's shown here.
There's the flood coming in. So basically, obviously you hope you have time before the flood hits to get the cars out of the garage, but otherwise there are techniques with a good foundation and openings in the walls to allow the flood to come through that space and actually use it for flood storage.
And the other part of this concept was the idea of a river walk. We really think you're missing opportunities at the edge of this asset. And it's difficult to walk along some of the highway. We've shown a sidewalk in our version that would connect. This is city property at the corner, so an amenity for the residents. And then the Riverwalk giving you an alternative to move through the community without having to risk life and limb on that very busy highway.
Right. So this sort of demonstrates some of the principles for filling in the gaps within an existing village center where it's really going to be visible. So buildings up along the road that would be attractively designed with a nice streetscape, closing off extra curb cuts, putting the parking behind, and then using the back area where it's quieter for residential buildings, but really linking them together. So this would be a large building over a parking garage with a deck outside, but then an open space across from that with visual access to the river, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really treating it all as a master plan project where the residential and the commercial work together to create something more than the sum of their parts, right? Of course, all this is imaginary. It's lots of things would have to be figured out to even approach doing this. But
And some of the larger scale projects can be phased as well. I talked about for sale units that might help finance a second phase of development. And this is a private property, it's for sale right now. But it's hard to imagine the interest in that property if someone doesn't understand there is a way to build there, right? So it's economically helping the community, it's adding vibrancy and vitality with people living there, and it's maintaining an edge versus just a place where water could flood.
And then we didn't do a big study of it, but up the Dostal property at Magic Mountain, a lot of you know that this has been vacant for a number of years. But what's really important about this is that the whole complex shares a single wastewater system, and this property has the right to dispose of 6,000 gallons per day, which is a lot for a fairly rural area. If it was all housing, somewhere between 60, 100, 120 units possible. If a restaurant returned to it, the restaurant would use up a good part of that capacity. But it really is, it's a vacant site with wastewater already in place. It's sort of a no-brainer for redevelopment.
And it has that characteristic of being a node, not being strung along your major visual corridors. It's
Right.
tucked back and away. And in a place where workers are needed, where people could walk to work.
So finally moving up to beautiful Weston Village. We walked around there at the beginning of our visit a few days ago and really looked at the
Vermont Country Store.
Vermont Country Store, for Pete's sake. And this is a plan of existing conditions on that, and then potentially for a little bit of new development, sort of in the back of the property, again tucked away up against the hill.
And I know you have a lot of parking demand, but we think there might be some efficiencies of parking. We've allocated some places for busing that would allow for some worker housing tucked against the back, improve the visual character of the parking lot, and in our mind, they have the character of the houses from the front street. And we've seen in several of the villages where you sort of have a front row and then there's kind of a tucked back row of houses.
And then finally, the last one we'll talk about is the Weston Recreation Area further to the north. And this as you know, has I guess again, it's a highway department facility, but it has a beautiful park with a pool and good road access on two sides, and a fair amount again of potential development space tucked around the edges. So this is a possible look at a series of units that would be put at both edges. One of course sort of framing the entry road, where you would have a number of, again, sort of complex, interesting building forms lined up with the parking behind and in between, and perhaps a larger cluster of buildings, again with the parking tucked behind, buildings lined up along the road and facing the open space. So again, just sort of basic principle, try to get the parking out of the way, try to make the buildings something beautiful, whether you're seeing them from the road or seeing them from the open space, and something that really looks like it belongs in one of your towns and not somewhere else. So that's sort of where we got. I'm sorry I lost that one image, but we'll dig it out for the report.
We'll bring it in from the truck. And so the other takeaway from our point of view is that some of the examples we picked, we think might be typical, the parking behind your business. We think if we had been able to get out and walk back all around the villages, we might have found more incidents where there's parking that's not very efficient, and there might be the ability to tuck a little row of worker housing in there. So it's given as an illustrative example, but we think it has ability to scale across a lot of different village circumstances.
And that's it. Is there any quick reaction to any of these being really crazy or really great? in between, yeah.
Well, do we really want Q&A now before we finish? the
Well, I'm just saying,
presentation?
before we sort of lose track of this, just any quick reactions.
I'm curious if you've seen examples in Vermont with floodways and building above them. I know the Brandon example, which is fabulous, the culvert they built. But they didn't put anything above it, I believe. I think it's under the roadway.
There's a transportation center and apartments in Montpelier.
Okay.
And part of what we'll flesh out, we hope, in the final report are more case studies or examples that we can help you build confidence that somebody's done it. So very good question, but that's typical of the final report that we would have case studies. Yeah.
And I'm curious for the picture near the mill, does Route 100 stay at the existing level or is Route 100 lifted?
For our studies right now, we just took what...
Kept it where it was.
But I think if it was raised, that changes some of the... I did, based on, I mean, you could see this drawing, it's about this big, elevate the platform so you would move from the sidewalk up steps to get into the new mill. So trying to give as much capacity in that lower level parking, but that's the sort of nuance. The earlier plans that some people who spend a lot more time with may have recommended that, but we did not.
Interested on the Kendall Farm Road property of that 400 acres. It's a long road, it's a dirt road, it probably would have to be paved. But how much of that would you see for a community? Because you were talking about that becoming like a different, its own little village and
Yeah, well, again, it's all driven by the sort of carrying capacity of the road as well as the wastewater and water supply. But you could easily fit a couple hundred units on 40 or 50 acres of that 400 and have the rest of it in permanent conservation.
Or as part of your wastewater strategy.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And,
that amount of property gives you a lot of flexibility and some potential genetic phasing, like we talked about before.
It's the kind of thing, you know, honestly, if you're doing a town plan, you would say, we wouldn't say, oh, you should just have a developer come in and build market rate housing there. But there is that opportunity because it's town owned to build something with deep affordability and a mix of housing, whether it's market rate or affordable, that could meet lots of different needs, seniors and so on. So that's an opportunity I think which is worth exploring.
Yeah. So, you know, that was part of the point of exploring the school site and saying maybe there's some for sale units there.
Right.
Because part of some of those development strategies could be about that mix of uses, which then helps phase two, or helps with covering the cost of administration of the project.
Attracting developers.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
If anyone wants to see, we're going to move on to Joel, but if anybody wants to see that missing one, it's on my other laptop. I could show you afterwards if you're curious. I just didn't get on this one, apparently.
Yeah.
So take us home.
Good news. Oh, hey, what am I hitting here? Just normal, right? Just
Arrows.
yeah, okay. I'm your last speaker. That's good news. So I've been doing this work for almost 18 years. And by this work, I mean working with teams like this in communities and processes like this all over the world. Biggest communities in the world, really tiny communities, all kinds of issues. And I know by this point in the evening, at least a portion of the room is sitting there saying, wow, that's a lot of ideas. Who are these people and how do they think we will ever get something like this done? That's every community, right? And I am here to convince you that you can. And it's not because I'm some great salesperson, it's because I believe in the work, because I have seen communities like yours do this and become inspiring stories. So I'm here to share some of how that happens with you, with some stories from other communities we've worked with. And a little bit of context setting. You know, we've been talking about, you guys have had a tough recent run. Nobody I'm not from here, but I can see that immediately, right? You can see it in your river corridors. You can see it in the data we shared. You can hear it in your voices this week. I can see it on your faces. I get it, right? The only comfort in that is that everybody else is having the same struggles. And there is, in that shared struggle, there are lessons to be learned from one another. There are partnerships to be had with others going through this. There are lots of opportunities, right? So, we're talking about how every jurisdiction in America has a housing crisis right now. We're talking about how, wealthy folks are buying up properties. In 2021, 1 of every 7 homes in America was purchased not by a family, by an investor, right? I come from Virginia, in the DC area. Last year, 1 in 4 homes was all cash purchase, right? It's killing us. It's killing us. All of us are in this struggle together. Climate is very similar, right? I've got a picture from your little market. You don't need the picture because you lived this, right, of your flood. But this is just a sample, right? I could have put dozens of photos up here from other communities we've worked in, but below your flood picture is a tornado disaster from Cheryl's community, right, where we worked several years ago. The middle picture is from Bastrop, Texas, where they had the largest fire in state history, which is already now the second largest because there was a bigger one after that, right? And the third picture is just a regular old thunderstorm in Savannah, and we were on our way to one of these community meetings and came across this elderly woman stalled out in it. Long story short, I had to wade in. We couldn't move the vehicle. We ended up having, because the flood water was rising, ended up having to pull her out of the window. And that's just the new normal that we're all struggling with, right? So is this easy work? No, right? Are the challenges daunting? Yes. Is it worth it? Absolutely. And it can be the most meaningful work you are ever a part of in your own communities. The other thing that we see everywhere is stress, right? And battles, right? And this is killing us. These photos come from New Orleans and then from my region in Prince William County, where instead of moving forward, right, in the basketball game, we're not going to ever score if we're going this way, right? And then turn around and going this way. And that's what we're doing in so many of our jurisdictions. I heard you guys had a planning board that resigned. Guess what? It's not unusual. It's happening in my region too. It's a struggle that we have to get beyond. We all have to get on the same page. And the difference between communities that become these inspiring stories and communities that struggled for years is getting beyond this paralysis, right? Getting beyond nostalgia of what we used to have, getting beyond the fights over, I don't like that idea, I don't like this one, we're going to keep going different directions, and getting together, figuring out what we can begin doing, what we agree on now, and building momentum. This game is all about momentum. So, these are images from your community. I can see it, right? And rural power is a real thing. I know you guys know this, but I've seen this, all over the country. One of the strengths that towns like yours have is that you're small. Everybody talks about, I know, everybody in here is on like 5 boards. I get it, right? You're stretched, right? And resources are stretched. I get it. But there's power in that too, because you are small. Once you get everybody together, you can make change and you can build momentum at a rate that giant jurisdictions never pull off. And I've seen it again and again. So, quick illustration. I'll have some of different sizes. This is a bigger place, Dubuque, Iowa, right? But quick illustration of what I mean. Dubuque is a town on the Mississippi. They don't have river flooding. They have flooding based on their topography, right? Something that's familiar. So, they had 6 presidential disaster declarations before they got to a point where, okay, this is untenable. In an area of their city, the B Branch watershed, where 50% of the folks live and 50% of them work. So this is a critical area of their city, and they literally have folks who are, you got a tornado moving in, everybody heads to the basement. I can't because my basement's full of water, right? And what are we going to do, right? So they finally had the hard conversations. We were there in, God, I want to say it's 2008. Had the hard conversations, right? Because this started with things like buyouts, right? There were homes here that just they weren't going to work, right? It's the level of the conversation that I heard somebody this week say, well, we really ought to consider moving the town further up. I wouldn't say that in public, they're having that level, they had that level of conversation, right? And then said, well, we don't have the resources So, okay, this is a 50-year plan. 50 years, right? And how can we begin to look at components of it and then match resources to it? They are now 15 years into it, right? They have they've raised federal, state, they've done a TIF district locally, they've combined all kinds of funds. They've raised more than 50% of the money. And this is sort of the first phase. This is a major change with daylighting the creek and creating all kinds of infrastructure that includes federal grants that are going house by house and doing retrofits to homes in vulnerable areas where folks don't have money to do everything from HVAC replacement to mold remediation to permeable pavements, et cetera, et cetera. It's full scale. And on top of it, once you have this incredible investment in the game, what else can it do for us, right? And so thinking about, context of housing, when we're creating new developments, what else can that do? What other community needs can we meet? In their case, it's everything from public space. They have amphitheaters along this. It's obviously a recreational greenway now. You've got orchards, you've got gardens. It's providing it's become the central space in this community, and something that other communities are visiting from around the world to learn about the flood mitigation piece, but people are coming to experience it because it's a great place to be as well. It's become a central place in their community. A little bit smaller, this is Helper, Utah, town of 2,000. Different context, they were a mining town. I love their sort of iconic image of the kid who was working the mines back in the day, but the mines all closed. So they had, unemployment rates of 16, 17%. Their downtown was full of vacant buildings. They do have a river, and they're in Utah. They had issues with the river. All familiar stuff, right? Or not familiar in terms of the vacant so much, but familiar in terms of issues. We had a process with them that was really simple. We were asking them things like, if you had 1,000 volunteers, what project would you do, right? If you had $100,000, what project would you do? What are you personally willing to volunteer on, right? And then we mapped all that out and said, what are you waiting for? And they didn't wait any longer. They literally, with their own hands, did a lot of this work. They created new parks. They did riverfront remediation work. They did their own Main Street. And literally were laying tiles with, this is a community that had a number of immigrant communities drawn to the mines, right? So the history of it. And they have all these plates down the street with, welcome friend in different languages that the families that live there designed and actually installed. So this is really meaningful work, right? Their community is now a statewide model. They've won tons of awards. Their downtown doesn't have vacancy. It has new investment. It's got new theaters. All kinds of great things are happening. And it started with literally, what can you do with volunteers? The little bit smaller community, Winhall Haven, Maine. Anybody been to Winhall Haven? So a couple people know it, right? So this is a town of 1,100, except in the season when they triple in size, right? You guys know how that goes. So here we have a coastal community that has issues with sea level rise, regular flooding, and then storm flooding was crazy, including earlier this year. I think it was January was their latest event. 2017 they started, right? They were looking for federal money. There's no federal money. Somebody, Wayne, I think, said, hey, would you guys be willing to, while you're waiting for something to happen, have an AIA team come work with the community? Why not? So it started there. But 7 years of planning later, this is why planning is important, right? Is because they kept doing the work, the science. They did, work on their ferry, building all the planning work. What do we need? The technical stuff. So when the funds became available at the federal and state level, they were ready. And now they've got millions of dollars of work going into literally raising roads. They're redoing the ferry building. They're building seawalls that protect other downtown assets. Their downtown is now in a much more stable place, or will be when the construction is done. But it was all about the conversations that you guys have been having and are continuing with this process. Is about building that momentum and scaling it. We've been talking. I've worked in Vermont a couple of times previously, Newport and Shelburne. So I understand it. When we had a process in Newport, we had folks from both the whole congressional delegation and state cabinet officers at the table, right? Because that's your culture in the state of 600,000 people. So you have an opportunity. I'm excited that this conversation included 4 towns, and we had folks who came from towns that weren't part of the 4, here the other night, because there is interest, right? And people see the opportunity. This can really scale. This is an effort from Utah, another rural state, a bigger rural state, where they literally have gone town to town and they've involved 52,000 people in growth management plans that help fund state money to local communities. And it continues, it goes through phase after phase. Finally, it's about not necessarily, part of it is breaking it into bit chunks that we can deal with, right? Because a lot of our conversation this week is like, all right, we need 350 new housing units. That's a big number, right? And so part of it is looking at the opportunity sites where we can get something. What can we get going easy? What are the projects that need more time or need additional work to get there? But it's also about, okay, where do we want to be in 20 years, right? And how is that driving the small steps we're taking day by day? This is an actual article 20 years afterward, right? They had a process like this. This is about a downtown. And they literally, this is from a Texas community, San Angelo. They literally wrote a headline story 20 years later and an op-ed to thank the team that worked with them. And the quote that I love is, was 2012 when this was published, and they said, back in 1992, your ideas seemed like dreams. Now we are living those dreams. And they go through point by point what came out of the report and how they implemented that. In their case, they started with, they had a river, a downtown, and a historic fort. And one of the recommendations was connecting those. And so the first project they did was a pedestrian bridge across the river in a walkway, right? And we didn't call it crowdfunding then, but it was old school fundraising. The community paid for it, not the city. And that kind of kicked things off and stirred interest. So people wanted to invest in downtown, and now they're in a completely different place, whole new set of issues. Like everybody, it doesn't ever end, right? But you don't get a better quote than that, right? Like, we worked on this for 20 years. Now we are living the things that we thought were overwhelming that night when these guys were giving us all these ideas. Right? It's possible. So the only question left is, what are you going to do next? It is possible, you can do it, and it's all about working together, building the partnerships, and doing what you can, week by week, connecting it to that 20-year vision. Who am I turning it over to?
You can send them comments.
So we want to either hear your ideas of what you think you should do next, having heard this whole presentation, or if you have specific follow-up on any of it, that will field those questions as well. Who's feeling burning interest? Yes, ma'am.
I'm very interested in what can be done with Winhall, and understanding the wastewater, what it can handle. It is a large property. It is owned by the town. I would love to see more on that. Just what can it handle? How many acres? How much to go into conservatorship? We're lucky. We're connected to Stratton. There's money there. There's people, developers that will want workers there. There's a need. There could be 200 units, 150 to 200 multi-use dwelling would be incredible.
Did everybody hear that? Kendall Farm Road priority. Thinks that's a great opportunity. You want to do all the groundwork and understand it fully.
Thank you.
Hold on. Who likes that idea? Okay, great.
You want her to show, just real quick before you take, you want to show this?
Oh, you want to show your image?
This was the site where the town offices are in the historic school in Londonderry, South Londonderry. This is their shed, which we fenced off, the garage. We'd love to actually see that move. we'd like to see some consolidation of services across the region, so everybody doesn't have to build, but, you know, maybe where I live, the first thing we got cooperation on was the library system. We start slow. This is townhouses, a larger apartment building with some adjacent units that are more ADA friendly, townhouses here and here. So I think we ended up with just plus or minus 35 to 40 units, depending on, and all the cases where you saw some numbers where we were calculating number of units were ballpark, because it's different with the mix of 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom units. But in our mind, any good development has that potential to have a mix of units to attract people at different price points and at different family points. So the one that will be in the report and that was in the slides has labeling that helps you understand that, you know, this is the school, this is the garage. Yes.
Just the library land that lays beyond.
Well, we couldn't find it in the tax maps.
They own behind the garage that's right there.
This garage.
Yeah, they own how many acres? 16? Oh, I'm not sure. Something.
Well, even better opportunities there.
I think it's about 20.
We were looking at this because partly the city owns it, but partly because there's some really nice topographic things. It's out, as we've said a number of times, it's a safe place to build. It's also fairly invisible, where we think, you know, this should be village-centric character. It also is a place where you've got the potential to build the simplest repetition of units, and you change the character by finished materials, by some have dormers, some don't, which is essentially, when you look at your villages, what your housing type is. They're all boxes that are arranged carefully, but they also have beautiful proportions. And so part of what we tried to do was to understand the sort of verticality of a lot of your building types. So anyway, this labeled and hopefully more understandable, but we'll look at this. Chris told us there was library property there. We just couldn't verify that on the tax maps. So, thanks. Well, all those illustrations are here if anybody's interested in asking.
Yes, ma'am.
I absolutely love that idea. However, that area between the town office and the garage, where it slopes down, is a wetland.
Did you hear that?
Oh, I did, it's a wetland?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm surprised it didn't show up on our maps because the work that...
Just tiny, but
Yeah, I mean,
this is where we think about like
it's enough to
no net
have been a
loss.
real pain in the ass over, running lines out there.
Okay. We did have wetlands marked, in fact, on the property out in Winhall. We think that a portion of that is wetlands, and that would be part of the reason you would do a meadow with development tucked in and around the edges. But we'll go back and look at that.
And can I say something real quick? Yeah. So one of the things that, as a state, I think the Act 250 reform and even the new Flood Safety Act talks about, like, it doesn't say, part of that is like wetlands. It doesn't say you can't displace wetlands. It says no net loss. So what you've got to do is replace that wetland 1 or 2 times, right? So if you take out that little, what is it, probably a half-acre wetland or something, if you take that out, then you remediate that someplace else within the town, or you conserve another one or something like that. Because one of the things that we're going to have to reconcile as a state is, like, you're trying to build, you're trying to create a more flood resilient and adaptive village, which means there are going to be some places you shouldn't build and some places you should conserve. But there are other places that it makes your village survive. It helps the town survive. And so there's opportunities there to redevelop it. I mean, normally I'm not a big fan of wetlands, and they're going to be a huge fan of wetlands. Not a big fan of getting rid of them, and they are critical. But like in that case, that is a trade-off in order to actually preclude them further development up in the headwaters, where every damn roof, every damn driveway, you're going to increase impervious surface, you're going to exacerbate the flooding coming downstream, and guess what? You're going to have more people living on dirt roads that you, as your biggest single town budget item, you're going to have to maintain. And as you start thinking, I'm not saying do this or not, it's just how do you think about this? The other thing to think about is you put money into this, it's like, oh, if we put public money into a wastewater system, we put public funding into the people who live there, think about how much you subsidize every house on a Class 3 town road. I mean, I do too. I live in Townsend. I used to live in Newfane. I mean, we all do this. It's a huge budget item. And so then we fret over something small that can make a huge difference for the community as a whole and for generations to come and for the people who live there now versus just maintaining the status quo. So don't mean to riff on this too much about the wetland, but I guess the point is that it's okay to change things. And
I'm glad you expanded on that because I wasn't aware that you could, that there was that kind of flexibility around it.
it's not easy, but that's also when, like, you are the power of the town and the planning commission and others and make the case. And even better if you say, we made this place this half-acre wetland, but guess what? We as a town are going to maybe you have a conservation fund or something, I don't know what it is, but it's like, we are going to make an effort to conserve 100 acres of wetland in the town to buffer flood, so that, to mitigate flooding, so that way we have a village, we have a town, we have people living here that don't have to worry about flooding anymore. And we sacrificed, a half acre, but by God, we created more opportunity over here. So that's the way to start looking at this. And it's really hard, especially when you don't have a lot of experience with this. But I can tell those of us who worked in more kind of high development environments, happens all the time, and sometimes for the better. Meaning, like, you actually wind up conserving more because you're precluding development where it really shouldn't be.
Yes, sir.
I know this is related to that still town office area. That shed you want to get rid of. We're thinking, one idea that I heard of that hopefully will gain traction is move the South Londonderry Fire Department down the road, which floods, up to that building, and then move the town garage to the Prouty property, which was designated for community property, right? Yeah, so it's got to be community property, whether residential can count in that or not. We'd have to talk through as a town. And so the other thing I wanted to say is, I live on West River Street, right at the end, near the depot where these guys have been working. And I want to say this is like the hardest working, most dedicated group I've ever seen. Yeah. I was there like 9:30 the other morning and before I had to go to Rutland to do a bunch of stuff. Came back 11 hours later and they were still there. Who knows how long they stayed.
We had a great host. His hospitality was second to none. He made us so comfortable we didn't want to leave.
And a great lodge, too.
That's right.
Yes, we really enjoyed being in your community.
You guys showed us what kind of community you guys have through that. It was great. We felt warmly welcome.
Well, we appreciate all your thoughts. It's really helpful. This plus the South Londonderry revitalization, which I'm on too, who knows where we'll go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I love your visual. I love you are here. What do you do next? We have no idea. So,
there will be a report coming.
Would you please direct the Winhall people?
Well, here's the bottom line, right? So yes, there will be a report coming, narrative, case studies, illustrations, recommendations about places you could go for help, resources, etc. But the bottom line is we can't tell you what to do. And those communities that I was talking about, we gave them ideas, right? Or they gave us ideas and we said, this is what we thought. But at the end of the day, they have their own conversations. And in some cases, there's another community in Washington State. We didn't give them this idea. We said, you have these strengths and weaknesses when you're downtown. And then the first thing they did was volunteers got donated paint and repainted 43 buildings over 2 months. And they kind of kicked off something that was hundreds of millions of dollars in a few years. We didn't tell them that. It's what moves you together. There will be champions, as Wayne mentioned earlier, who pick up a project or have a cause that's a component of this that lead on it. And that's great to have different leaders, different pieces, but you have to be on the same page about where you're going as a community and understand how these things connect and complement one another. We can't tell you that at the end of this. The report will have suggestions, but you're going to have to decide. It's going to require more conversation.
And the other thing I'll just add, Matt, we're working with you guys now, so on Winhall, on your town plan. And planning is like really, ideally, it's like a perpetual iterative process. It's not something you just do, put it on a shelf, revisit it 8 years later and go, what did we do? But it really should, and one of the things that you can actually do in a plan is create these action steps, like these are the other things that we need to do. And I think the other thing that this process shows you, my background, I came into planning from public administration and landscape architecture. I use both sides of my brain. But the value of having designers as part of the planning process. Now, in my perfect world, we'd be able to have like a landscape architect on staff too. I'm biased. Low architects. But for our purposes, though, especially like how should development sit on the land is kind of a critical reason. So one of the things to think about is like supplementing like municipal planning grants, doing the planning part well, but then also being able to do the visualization. Because the thing about this charrette process is, and being able to have designs is then beyond the words on the page, which everybody's going to have a different vision, you're actually creating a collective vision. So everybody, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, at least you can say at one point in time, he says, this is what we think this could look like. And then you actually have that point of reference. When the in planning world, we talk about the plan for Chicago. That was actually, they created this master plan for Chicago. They actually taught it in the public schools. I assume they don't anymore. But that was actually mandatory education so that everybody, all the kids growing up knew what Chicago was going to look like. And they pursued it. And it's one of the great American cities. It's an amazing place. It's got issues. They reversed a river. They have basements on these buildings that flood. Lessons learned. But that's overkill. But that's the idea. You create a plan, you keep working on it, and you keep having this buy-in process in the community, and then that's how you move forward. Because then you know what you're raising money for, and you're not taxing people or raising public dollars or whatever. For them, you're doing it for you. And if you do it for you, then it's going to be authentic. So many of the places I've worked before, like in rural, more depressed areas, it's always about how do we make this a place more attractive to others? And my answer was always, make it attractive to you, do it for you, and maybe it's even future generations. Maybe you won't even be here to enjoy it, but then it's real and authentic, and it's a place that is going to be durable into the future.
And the other point is, once you get to that point where you can see it when you visit a community that has that vision, because it's expressed all over the place. Once you start doing that, things that you never thought were possible suddenly start happening. And I see it, and I can give you dozens of stories where that started happening. And we went back a few years later, and I wanted to cry because I couldn't believe what I had seen. This little place that I didn't think could do it in 20 years, and 5 years later, it's like, holy cow. And that's the goal. We got time for one more.
I just wanted to elaborate on what Bruce said. I'm Tom Kavanaugh, Select Board Chair for the town of Londonderry. The Prouty property, this is just so you can have it for your report, is basically the only usable piece of land the town owns. And that was bought specifically for if we ever need a police station. As Bruce said, either the town garage or the fire department or multiple fire departments might move there. So just as a town official, I'm a little hesitant about giving up much of that land because half of it's in the floodplain already.
That's a great point. Anybody want to add to that? You want to add to that, man? Or you have something different?
No.
All right, I'll let you be the last one.
No.
You good? All right. Well, we want to thank you guys everybody for being here tonight and for being in conversation with us all week. Wayne, did you have anything? Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep, go for it.
So how was this process about multiple towns talking about visions for what could happen? Was this kind of help you think more about what could happen in your own town or opportunities you hadn't? I mean, how does this feel? Does this feel useful? Is this something you think other towns did? Did you benefit from it? Do you think other towns might benefit from this
We're all
approach?
living through the same issues, so being able to talk about it collaboratively instead of in silos is nice because, you know, to me, it's embarrassing that there's not a place a teacher can buy a house in my town. You know, we have an entire police department, not one of them live closer than 30 minutes.
Does it feel like it kind of broke down like the town, the invisible town borders that kind of...
Yeah, we're very closely connected, I think, all of these towns in a lot of ways. So I think putting us all together was very natural.
Great.
And it's great to hear all the ideas and crosstalk. I mean, we all know all the towns, so it's really interesting to see how we're all going to develop, how we're all going to take this information and go further with it, and maybe hopefully work together in that process.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, all you guys for coming out, and then the whole team for coming from around the country, and you, the students, and I mean, it's been great for me. I hope we can do more of this. And I think it's always good just kind of have an exchange of ideas from people who've lived it and seen it in other places, and but really appreciate all the time and energy and effort that everybody's done. I hope you're able to get, I'll talk to you if you're welcome to stay with us if you get stuck. She's has to fly back to Atlanta, which is having a, but really appreciate everybody, all the work that everybody did. I think it's been great. You're free.